Welcome to this online lesson on the Battle of the Somme 1916. How far was the Battle of the Somme a success for the British? That might seem like a strange question to ask, given that perhaps no other battle in British military history conjured up such images of senseless, needless waste of life as the Battle of the Somme. Indeed, the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916 was the worst day in British military history, and it still is to this day. Well, as with many famous events, this event is shrouded in mystery at times, and certainly has been clouded by much mythology over the years. As historians, we need to try and penetrate the mists of time and work out what the truth is. To start that, I've included a photograph source at the top of this slide. In fact, this is not truly a photograph, it's a still taken from a film. During the Battle of the Somme, the British government had authorised the creation of a documentary film. Although they were initially reluctant to release it, when they did release it, it gave, for the time, quite an honest and brutal account of what the fighting was really like. The British government realised that the British people knew that there was destruction and death during the war, and that it would actually benefit them to see what the soldiers were doing so that they would back them up and support them when everyone was becoming rather war-weary. What's interesting, though, is that historians at the Imperial War Museum in London employed lip-reading experts to study the mouth movements of the soldiers captured in these films. Of course, they were silent films at the time, and so none of the actual speech was recorded. One soldier in this particular clip said something quite shocking. Consider this task. This image shows Lancashire Fusiliers in a sunken lane before an attack on the 1st of July 1916. The lip reader identified this quote from one of the men. I'll put the quote up in a moment. Tragically, 20 minutes later they were ripped apart by machine gun fire. Many of them were killed and wounded. Consider, what does this quote tell us about the men's confidence and preparedness for this battle? For many of them, after all, it was their first battle. What does it tell us about the men's confidence in their leaders? And how representative do we think of wider attitudes this quote may be? Well, why have I held off showing you the quote until this time? Well, it's because, and we may be surprised by this, it's got a certain amount of foul language in it, which I will not repeat here, but I'm sure you've got the imagination to fill in the gaps. Let's remember that these people were truly human beings, and they would have spoken much as soldiers might do today. They don't necessarily just have the stilted speech of a modern Hollywood blockbuster. Here's the quote. They've something up again. I hope we're in the right place this time, otherwise I'm going to bomb them all and then something off. That's an interesting quote as far as I'm concerned. Have a go at those questions, and if you do want to, pause the video now. How did you get on interpreting that quote? Does it suggest the men have got particular preparedness? Well, they look prepared, don't they? They've got their bayonets fixed, they've got their helmets on. These were actually quite a new innovation at the Battle of the Somme. They've got their rifles ready, and they do look really well equipped to go into battle. But if this soldier is not entirely clear as to where they are, then perhaps they're not as prepared as they seem. What about the confidence in their leaders? Well, if he's saying that these people have messed up again, and I'm going to be charitable with my language here, perhaps it suggests that there's not a lot of confidence in their leaders that they're going to get it right. Although do remember, it is a soldier's eternal right to gripe and moan about their circumstances. How representative of wider attitudes can this one quote be? Well, that's something that's almost impossible to answer. But by investigating other videos and looking at other soldiers' accounts and survivors' accounts of the battle, perhaps we can shine some light on that. I've included, by the way, in the description to this video, a link to the Battle of the Somme film. It is a silent film, and at times you might not find it that interesting, but if you want to discover more about the Battle of the Somme, it's a really good starting place if you want to extend your knowledge. Let's move on. Let's consider first of all the challenges that the British would have to overcome in their attack on the Somme. Though the Germans couldn't advance, they could fight defensively. They simply needed to sit tight until their enemies gave in. The British and French needed to retake land, and they knew that this would cost lives. The advantages for the defender included the use of smokeless powder, which made it very difficult to see where the guns were, accurate and fast-firing artillery, and machine guns. Complex, several miles deep trench systems with deep shelters and overlapping defences. thick, tangled barbed wire in front of the trenches. Most British shells were incapable of cutting this wire. And no way of accurately knocking out German guns. Artillery bombardments were noisy but often ineffective. When the guns stopped firing, the Germans knew an attack was on its way and could rush to their defensive positions. Your tasks then: consider each of these challenges, that are shown as bullet points above, and put them in order from most to least challenging. Then briefly explain your choices for most and least challenging. Why have you placed them where you have? Lastly, how might the British be able to overcome these challenges? Give that some consideration as an extension. Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Okay, ready to move on? Well, let's learn a little bit about the plan. July the 1st, 1916 was the date that the Battle of the Somme began, but it was not a one-day battle. In 1916, Kitchener's new army was ready to make its first big attack. Remember, these were primarily the volunteers who had joined in 1914 and had been in training for the last few years and months. A 26-mile front line north of the River Somme in France was chosen. The preparations were the most detailed yet made, and the idea was simple. Firstly, the purpose of the battle was to relieve pressure from the hard-pressed French who were fighting a life-or-death struggle at Verdun, something that was to prove even more destructive even than the Battle of the Somme. Secondly, to break through the German lines and restart a war of movement away from the trenches. In other words, break the stalemate. And then thirdly, quite simply, win the war. Your tasks then: what will be the greatest challenges of this attack, bearing in mind what we've already read about? And secondly, based upon this, how likely of success do you think this will be? Now, try not to cloud your judgment as to what you know happens with this battle, but think about the likelihood of the success given what we know about the nature of trench warfare, the nature of the stalemate and the defensive weapons of the First World War. Pause the video now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Let's have a look at the plan. Some years ago, I drew this simple diagram to show the basic way that the Battle of the Somme was intended to work. I took the example of the objective of one of the companies of the Accrington Battalion. Their objective was a small village called Serre, which was on top of a small rise in the land in the northern sector of the Battle of the Somme. Your task is to summarise this plan based upon my commentary. You might even want to create a little diagram similar to this one of your own. I should point out, although I'm sure it's obvious, that this is not drawn to scale. The first part of the plan is an artillery bombardment. Over 1 million shells have been set aside for this purpose, and it was intended that British artillery would bombard the German trenches for anything up to a week. Secondly, aircraft of the Royal Flying Corps would spot for the artillery and bomb the Germans. A British BE-2 spotter plane is shown. Their bomb loads were very limited, and so they were more useful as spotter planes, making sure the artillery were hitting the correct targets. Thirdly, as a result of this bombardment, the barbed wire in front of the trenches would be cut. Also, it was intended that the German trenches would be absolutely devastated by this bombardment, the heaviest yet conducted by the British Army during this war. As a result, it was expected that British troops would be able to advance from their own trenches completely unopposed. And then, the German-held trenches and towns would be taken, the Germans would surrender, and British troops would march to victory. A simple plan, and some of the best military planning is simple. Fewer things can go wrong and fewer misunderstandings can be made on the ground. So pause the video now, create your own diagram, or in some other way summarise this British plan. But remember, this is only the plan, and label it as such. The reality was tragically different. Okay, let's move on to see what really happened. So what was the result? First of all, have a look at the map. The solid line shows the initial position of the British and French trenches, with the French in the south of the sector, right next to where it says 1st of July. Then, the initial dotted line is how far they had got within 2 weeks of the battle starting. This is not the crucial breakthrough that was hoped for by the planners. Then by the 15th of September you can see they've captured a similar amount of land. And then lastly, by November and the conclusion of the battle, you can see just how far the British had been able to advance. The truth is, this advance, in its greatest extent, was barely more than 7 miles. That's a lot of blood and destruction for so little land captured. Indeed, in the northern section near the Serre, no land was captured at all. So let's consider what went wrong. The Somme. Perhaps no name in British military history carries such heavy connotations of disaster and heartbreaking, appalling death. On the first day alone, 19,240 British and Empire soldiers were killed, and 57,470 were wounded, missing or captured. I often find that these big numbers are quite difficult to get my head around, so instead I compare it to the population of towns that I know. For example, I'm based in North Devon. One of our biggest settlements is the town of Barnstable, around 22,000 people in all. So it helps me to understand this by imagining that a population the size of a reasonable sized town like Barnstable was wiped out and killed in that one day. And yet in total 3 times that number were also wounded. It's remarkable and very sobering to think about that. Perhaps consider the population of your local area and compare that to the figures. Just let that sink in. Where I live in Torrington, we have a population of 5,279 people. 4 times that number were killed on this day and many more times wounded. It remains the worst day in the history of the British Army. Over 76,000 men in the course of the battle were lost and simply never found between July and November. Some years ago I visited this memorial. It's called the Thiepval Memorial. You might be able to find the settlement of Thiepval on the map. It's absolutely enormous. Those doors at the bottom are around 6 feet tall, and you can see some people standing next to it. And it is covered with the names of soldiers. And yet every year the number of soldiers' names recorded on that monument gets slightly less. Because this is a memorial to the missing, the men who were never found. And as they are found and identified, they are buried with a proper identified stone, and their name is respectfully removed from this monument. It gives you some sense as to the losses that so many were simply never found and identified. That said, the German army also suffered terribly defending their positions and the counter-attacking British gains. The German army arguably never recovered from these losses. So, by way of a task, I'd like you to record some of the key details here. Record the key dates of the battle. Look at the map. When did it begin and when did it end? How many British soldiers were killed and wounded on the first day? How many British soldiers were missing? And what was the result of the battle? Did it succeed in breaking through? Once you've recorded all the details that you want, continue the video. But for now, pause. Okay, hopefully you got everything that you need. Let's consider the specific reasons why the plan went wrong. What went wrong? This is not a simple question to answer. However, on the first day the British attack failed because of several reasons which we'll now go through. You might recognise this diagram from before. Well, actually it's a subtly different diagram with some pretty crucial differences that show the failures in planning. Who should we blame for this failure in planning? Well, ultimately, the person in charge of this attack was General Sir Henry Rawlinson. Rawlinson had never directed an attack like this before, but then nor had anyone else. This was an entirely new style of warfare. Similarly, his commanding officer, Field Marshal Haig, was directing a very large war and had also never fought a war of that style, nor had anyone else. It's often supposed that all British generals were far behind the lines, miles away in chateaux enjoying wine and fine food, while ordinary British soldiers were suffering in the trenches, but this is an oversimplification. After all, in the First World War, 20 generals were actually killed in action. Whatever the truth of these lions led by donkeys, as it's often summed up, is a historical debate that will rage for years. So we'll stick to the facts as to what went wrong that day, and indeed subsequent in the battle. Failure number 1 concerns the artillery. The artillery did indeed bombard German trenches for up to a week, but their accuracy was doubtful. Part of the reason for the lack of accuracy is explained by failing number 2. The aircraft cannot reliably see German lines because of cloudy weather. Also, many of them were shot down. At this period, the German Air Force had superior fighter aircraft to the British. Machines like the BE-2C pictured were sitting ducks to German aircraft that were more advanced in terms of their weaponry and performance. This meant that the fall of the artillery shells could not be accurately plotted. As a result, and as a result of using inadequate ammunition that was not designed for this purpose, barbed wire was not cut by the bombardment. Surviving troops could then be caught up in it as they crossed no man's land. In fact, a good way of looking at this is if the barbed wire was thick beforehand, when it was picked up by the exploding shells and then tossed all over the place, it became even more of a tangled mess. Not only that, but the Germans were safe from shell fire and deep dugouts. These are things that could not be seen from the air by British reconnaissance planes, and certainly couldn't be seen from the ground. The British fundamentally underestimated the strength of the German defences. Many of these dugouts were equipped with electric lighting, a luxury that many British homes didn't even have. Although the Germans were certainly stressed out and exhausted by the incessant bombardment, they were not killed and driven mad in quite the way that they were expected to have been. Not only that, destroyed villages, as the war advanced, allowed the Germans to take up ideal defensive positions overlooking the battlefield. This meant that the Germans had time to man their defences before the British advance. After all, the British would not risk shelling their own men. The artillery bombardment worked on a timetable. What this meant is the British artillery would stop firing, the British would then advance, and the Germans would have time to man their defences and gun them down. Because the British did not want to rush ahead too quickly and then leapfrog ahead of the artillery and risk being hit by them, they were commanded to walk across no man's land, an order that seems completely insane now, but actually was all about keeping to a timetable at a time when there were no real reliable ways of communicating with soldiers once they had been committed to battle. The stopwatch and the orders of the officers was all they had to go on. But the tragic result of all this was that the British troops were almost immediately cut down by machines and shrapnel as they advanced from their trenches across no man's land, and very little land was gained at all. You might want to draw your own diagram based upon this, or indeed make other notes, but in some way summarise all the things that went wrong that day. Pause the video while you do this. Okay, we'll have a look at one further example before we move on. This aerial photograph, taken more recently, shows the position of German trenches. The German trenches are shown on the right-hand side in red. The British trenches are shown in the blue. This gives us some impression as to just how close together these trenches could be. And yet, you can't fail to have noticed the enormous crater. This was one of several mines that were set off before the battle. British tunnellers had dug under German lines and painstakingly over weeks and weeks laid enormous explosive charges underneath the trenches. It was expected that when these were blown up, they would have obliterated a section of German front line and allowed the British to advance unopposed. This is the trench, or rather the mine crater at Lochnagar. Another was at Hawthorne Ridge, and a video can be seen in the description, or rather a link to that video. So why did such preparations fail? Well, if we look closely at this photograph, we might be able to get a few clues. Notice the white staining in the field. This is the underlying chalk of the Somme region. It's very sticky, and when it's churned up it sticks all over to your boots. But not only that, the difficulty in crossing no man's land was compounded by the fact that the machine guns would have been firing from the village, even though it wouldn't have been that big. And also, the Germans were able to reoccupy this shell crater, line the rim of it, and use it effectively as a trench. It did not provide the breakthrough that was expected, regardless of how many men were killed in the initial explosion. So the Lochnagar crater is yet another monument to the failure of this offensive. But how much of a failure was it in the long term? Well, that's not quite so easy to answer, and it's what we'll consider to finish. So was it all a waste? The first day of the Battle of the Somme remains the worst day in British military history. However, over the course of the battle, the Germans suffered roughly the same number of casualties as the British and their allies did. The difference was, Germany could not replace its losses. The British and their empire could. With this in mind, and what we've learnt in the rest of the video, take some time to consider this final question and write down your answer. In your view, was the Battle of the Somme a waste of lives? After all, it has been argued, perhaps with some justification, that while the British Empire did recover from the trauma of these losses. The Germans did not. And perhaps ultimately that helped end the war. There's no wrong answer to this, but give it some thought, explain your answer, and we'll conclude the video there. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that helpful, and if you have, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much, and goodbye.